Lone rancher found a naked Chinese girl hanging on a tree with a sign, "White man don't forgive." The sun was a merciless hammer in the vast, empty sky, beating down on the cracked earth and the solitary figure of a man riding the fence line. Jacob moved with the economy of a creature born to this desolation, his face a landscape of its own, carved with the grief of a loss so profound it had scoured him of all but silence. His world was this arid expanse, his only company the ghosts of a wife and child taken by a fever that had left him standing while they fell. It was near a skeletal cartonwood, the only landmark for miles, that he found her. She was hanging by her wrists from a low branch, a pale, brutalized form against the dark wood. Her body was a canvas of cruelty, and above her head, a crudely painted sign was nailed to the trunk, its message a venomous spit into the eye of God, "White man don't forgive." For a long moment, Jacob did not move. He was a man who had made a pact with oblivion, yet the sight before him was a blasphemy that broke the treaty. He dismounted, his movements stiff, and with the cold precision of a surgeon, he cut her down. She was lighter than a sack of grain, a broken doll of a woman with raven hair and skin that bore the fading tattoos of a distant land. He wrapped her in his horse blanket, his touch surprisingly gentle, and lifted her into his arms. He did not look back at the sign. He already knew its words by heart, they were written on the wind in this unforgiving country. He brought her to his homestead, a small, defiant outpost of a cabin hunkered against the endless horizon. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dry wood and solitude. He laid her on his own cot, the only bed in the house, and began the slow, methodical ritual of care. With a basin of precious well water, he washed the dirt and blood from her skin, his large, calloused hands moving with a reverence he hadn't felt in years. He saw the lash marks on her back, the rope burns on her wrists, the bruises that bloomed like dark, terrible flowers across her body. Each mark was an indictment, a fresh wound in his own scarred soul. He worked in absolute silence, his jaw set, his eyes never leaving his task. When she was clean, he covered her with a fresh sheet and went to the hearth. He took the hateful sign he had ripped from the tree and placed it on the embers. He watched the wood blacken, the letters curling into illegibility before being consumed by the pure, cleansing fire. He sat there for a long time, the poker in his hand, feeding the flames until nothing remained but a fine grey ash. It was not justice, not even vengeance. It was a refusal. A small, solitary act of defiance against the world's bottomless cruelty. For 3 days, she was a ghost, hovering in the liminal space between life and death. Jacob sat vigil, a silent sentinel by her cot. He spoon-fed her thin broth, which she took without waking, her body's instinct to live fighting a silent war against the desire to let go. He changed the damp cloths on her brow and tended to her wounds with a salve of herbs his wife had once taught him to make. The cabin, once his tomb of silence, was now filled with a different kind of quiet, a tense, fragile waiting. He found himself speaking to her, his voice a low, rusty rumble from disuse. He did not tell her his story, he told her the story of the land. He spoke of the way the sun bled across the sky at dawn, of the stubborn resilience of the sagebrush, of the hawk that circled overhead each afternoon. He spoke not for her, but for himself, filling the void with the simple truths of his world, as if to anchor her spirit to the living earth. He expected no response, and he received none. She remained adrift in her sea of pain, her only movement the shallow rise and fall of her chest, a fragile flag of surrender and survival. On the 4th day, her eyes opened. They were dark, deep, and utterly vacant, staring at the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling as if she were looking through them into a place of unimaginable horror. When she saw him, a tremor of pure terror shook her small frame. She tried to scramble away, a wounded animal seeking any corner of escape, but her body betrayed her with its weakness. Jacob held up his hands, palms open, and backed away slowly. He understood this language. He had seen it in the eyes of a cornered coyote. He moved to the far side of the small room, putting the table and 2 chairs between them. He left a tin cup of water and a piece of bread on the table and then went outside, pulling the door shut behind him. For the rest of the day, he worked within sight of the cabin, mending a harness, splitting firewood, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He did not look directly at the window, but he was aware of her presence there, a fleeting shadow watching his every move. He was giving her the only thing he had to offer, space. He was letting the silence and the vast, empty land be her shield until she could find her own. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Jacob would rise before dawn, leave food and water on the table, and then depart for his long, lonely work. When he returned at dusk, the food would be gone, and she would be a silent fixture in the corner chair, watching him with those same haunted eyes. He never tried to approach her, never pushed for a word. He understood that her silence was a fortress, the last piece of ground she had not surrendered. One evening, he found a piece of charcoal from the fire and a flat, smooth piece of scrap wood. He placed them on the table near her untouched plate. He said nothing, made no gesture to it, simply ate his meal and retired to his bedroll by the dying fire. The next morning, the charcoal was on the floor, and the wood was covered in frantic, jagged lines. There was a shape that looked like a monstrous train, its smokestack belching blackness, and beneath it, a collection of cruel, leering faces with empty circles for eyes. It was a pictograph of her torment. Jacob looked at it, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He picked up the piece of wood, walked to the hearth, and placed it gently in the flames. He would bear witness to her pain, and then he would let it burn away. He would do this for as long as it took. Trust was not a bridge built with words, but with small, silent offerings. It was in the way he always left the cabin door unlatched, giving her the freedom to flee even though there was nowhere to go. It was in the way she began to sweep the floor after he left, a small act of order in their chaotic world. It was in the way she eventually moved from the corner chair to the table, eating her meal at the same time as him, the two of them separated by a few feet of worn wood and a universe of unspoken pain. One afternoon, he was chopping wood when the axe slipped, biting deep into his forearm. He cursed, a sharp, guttural sound, and stumbled back to the cabin, blood dripping from his fingers. She saw him from the doorway, and for the first time, the fear in her eyes was replaced by something else. She met him at the basin, took his arm with a surprising firmness, and began to clean the wound with the same gentle, methodical care he had once shown her. Her touch was featherlight, her focus absolute. As she wrapped the gash with a strip of clean cloth, their eyes met. In that shared moment of tending to a wound, a silent vow was exchanged. They were two solitary survivors, two keepers of each other's scars. The summer rains came, turning the cracked earth dark and releasing the pungent, clean smell of creosote. A thunderstorm, violent and sudden, broke across the plains one night, the thunder like the crack of doom, shaking the small cabin to its foundations. With the first deafening clap, she cried out, a raw, terrified sound torn from the depths of her soul. She scrambled into the corner, making herself small, her hands over her ears. Jacob did not go to her, knowing his presence would only be a greater threat. Instead, he lit another lantern, flooding the small space with a warm, steady light. He sat at the table, his back to her, and simply waited. He sat there for hours as the storm raged, a silent, unmoving guardian against the tempest both outside and within her. When the last rumbles faded into the distance and a profound quiet fell, he heard a small sound behind him. He turned. She was standing there, her hands clasped before her, her body still trembling. She looked at him, her eyes clear and focused, and her lips parted. "Jacob," she whispered. The sound was fragile, like a dried leaf skittering across the ground, but it was his name. It was the first word she had spoken. It was everything. The peace they had so carefully constructed was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Jacob heard them first, his body tensing with an animal instinct for danger. He looked out the window and his blood ran cold. 3 men, rough and bearded, reined in their horses in his yard. They were the faces from her drawing, their expressions a mix of arrogance and predatory amusement. Their leader, a big man with a cruel twist to his mouth, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Howdy, old man," he called out, his voice slick with false bonhomie. "Heard you found something of ours. A little Chinese trinket we lost out on the plains. We've come to collect it." Jacob stepped out onto the porch, his old rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. His face was a granite mask. "There's nothing here for you," he said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. "You best ride on," the man chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "Oh, I think there is." We left our mark on her. We aimed to finish the job from inside the cabin. There was a faint sound, the scraping of a chair. The leader's eyes lit up. He dismounted, his men following suit, their intentions written plainly in their sneering faces. The time for silence was over. The world exploded in a cacophony of smoke and thunder. Jacob fired first, the rifle bucking against his shoulder, sending one of the men staggering back with a cry. He ducked behind a water barrel as return fire splintered the wood of the porch railing. He was one man against three, his homestead now a battlefield. But he was not alone. Inside the cabin, the woman, he had decided to call her in his mind, the Chinese word for beautiful, was not cowering. She moved with a desperate, focused energy, barricading the door with the heavy table, her fear transmuted into a cold, hard will to survive. She found his second rifle, the one he kept over the mantel, and with hands that did not tremble, she began to load it. Jacob fired again, taking cover behind the corner of the cabin. A bullet grazed his side, a searing line of fire, but he ignored the pain. He saw the leader making a run for the barn, intending to flank him. He was caught. Just as the man raised his pistol, the cabin window shattered. A shot rang out, impossibly loud, and the leader crumpled to the ground. Jacob stared, stunned, at the window. Mai stood there, the long rifle in her hands, smoke curling from the barrel, her face a mask of fierce, terrible resolve. She had reclaimed her voice, not with a word, but with a bullet. They left under the cover of a moonless night. Jacob knew the other men from the railroad camp would come looking for their friends. This place, this sanctuary built on silence and sorrow, was no longer safe. He packed what they could carry onto his two sturdiest horses, a little food, water, ammunition, and the salve for their wounds. He paused at the door of the cabin, looking back at the simple, quiet life he was leaving behind. It had been a tomb, and then, for a brief time, it had been a home. He set a lantern on the table, knocked it over, and didn't look back as the flames began to lick up the dry wooden walls. They rode north, towards the jagged promise of the mountains, leaving the fire to erase their past. For days they rode, speaking little, the silence between them now a comfortable blanket of shared experience. As the sun rose on the fifth day, illuminating a hidden valley of impossible green, Mai reined in her horse. She looked at him, her eyes no longer haunted, but filled with a clear, steady light. She reached across the space between their horses and took his burned, bandaged hand in hers. There, in the heart of a new, untouched wilderness, they began again. Not as a protector and his ward, but as two equals, two survivors who had found in each other the one thing the world had tried so hard to take from them, a reason to live. You see, this is a story about more than just survival. It's about how the deepest wounds can sometimes create the strongest bonds. It's a reminder that true strength isn't about the absence of fear or pain, but about what we do in spite of it. Jacob and Mai, two people discarded by the world, found in each other's silence a language more profound than words. They discovered that a family isn't always something you're born into, sometimes, it's something you build, piece by broken piece, in the aftermath of a storm. Here at Wild West Love Stories, we believe that even in the harshest of landscapes, the most resilient thing that can grow is the human heart. If their journey to find peace moved you, please show your support by subscribing to our channel. Click that notification bell, because love and redemption are timeless tales, and we have many more to share.